This is the way the world ends.
Halo Infinite is dropping very soon, and for the first time in what seems like eons, I am excited about a Halo game. Halo 4 and 5 released when I was in university, and I didn't have the money or time to spend on new games. I was aware of their releases and followed the PR campaigns, but I didn't get to play them at launch. I did eventually play through them both, and to be honest, I can't remember anything that I particularly liked about them. The story of Halo 4 is almost non-existent in my memory, and I remember thinking that the concept of Halo 5's story was interesting, but again, kind of forgettable. What I can remember is that neither felt like the Halo that I grew up with. This may be partly because 4 and 5 were made by a different developer, but I suspect it's not as simple as that. I think part of it is due to the fact that the earlier games had a high position on my shelf of favourite video games, and that any deviation or change from the formula the originals introduced was bound to impact my perception of them negatively. There is something different about Halo Infinite though. I am actually excited for it. Everyone will be aware that it's had a pretty rocky PR road, with a negative reaction to the first look at gameplay resulting in not only memes, but the game being pushed back a whole year. This was meant to be a launch title for the Series X, and the fact that Microsoft felt like it needed a year back in the oven is a testament to how much of a rough shape it must have been in behind the scenes. Both Microsoft and 343 must also be acutely aware that interest in Halo has been in decline since 343 took over from Bungie. Rather than let Microsoft's flagship IP fizzle into nothing though, 343 seems to be trying to do something about it. For Halo Infinite, I remain cautiously optimistic. The multiplayer has had extensive beta testing recently and it seems that most people were enjoying it. SkillUp did an extensive video on the beta, so if you want more insight on the multiplayer side of things, go check out his video. I'll link it in the description. Even with the first gameplay reveal, and certainly with the most recent reveal 1 year on, it's clear a lot of work has gone into getting Halo Infinite up to scratch. The graphical polish that 343 are interested in showing off though, isn't particularly what interests me. Much like the first reveal, what had my ears pricked is the look and feel of Infinite. To me, it looks like 343 may be trying to go back to basics with Halo, maybe trying to replicate the original magic of the first 3 games and Reach. There's something about the look and feel of the gameplay footage that says 2 steps back and 1 step forward to me, which in my opinion might not be the worst idea. I truly believe that video games need to evolve to survive and stay relevant, but I'm not sure I've been enjoying what Halo has evolved into, and I know plenty of others feel the same way. I don't know honestly, maybe this is just a classic case of video game nostalgia getting in the way of enjoying progress and advancement. I generally like change, but for me, Halo hasn't felt like Halo in a long time. But it looks like there may be a slight chance that Halo is coming back for me. There might be a slight chance that the magic lives on in the next sequel, and that it might recreate some of the wonderful feelings I felt as a kid. In order to prepare for Halo Infinite, which I would very much like to review, I thought it would be appropriate in order to get perspective on this new game to go back and re-examine the first Halo game to fill me with excitement, and that's Halo 3. What I would like to do with this review is not only talk about the game itself, its positives and negatives, but I want to examine and analyse my nostalgia for the game. I haven't played Halo 3 in a long time, and I'm interested to see if the older, more mature me still feels the same way as 14-year-old me. Nostalgia is an interesting concept that isn't necessarily a bad or a good thing. I guess it depends on how it affects your current view of the material in question. There's nothing wrong with loving something from your youth despite its flaws, whether that's a movie, a TV show, or a video game. But where the issues start is when you can't be self-aware of the effect it might be having on your view of the present. So bearing that in mind, I want to dive into this game and some of my feelings towards it along the way. So get comfy, this is going to be a long one. You might be wondering, why Halo 3 and not Combat Evolved or Halo 2? Well, despite how I feel on the inside, I'm not that fucking old. I have played both the first and second Halo games, but Halo 3 was my first entry into the Haloverse, and my first introduction to the Master Chief. When I was much younger, I only played games on my dad's PC or on the PlayStation 1 and 2. That is, until one Christmas I received a shiny new Xbox 360, which came in a bundle with none other than Halo 3. Looking back at the lead up to that Christmas, I cringe at the thought of how much of an annoying little cunt I must have been. I certainly knew what I wanted, and what I wanted was Halo. I wasn't even particularly fussed about the other Xbox exclusives. and up until that Christmas I had been a PlayStation lad all the way. However, I got swept up in the marketing campaign for Halo 3. Whoever was in charge of that marketing campaign, I hope they got a crazy bonus because they fucking earned it. I remember not knowing who the Master Chief was, or who he was fighting, or what even the fuck a Halo was. All I knew for sure was that I wanted to finish the fight, despite not knowing who was fighting or what they were fighting about. The TVs, the buses, the cinemas, the magazines, you couldn't fucking move for Halo 3 PR, and I'm sure that anyone who was into gaming around that time will agree, the trailers for Halo 3 were some of the best game trailers ever made. The Starry Night trailer will stick with me forever.
Don't you? Do you think we'll ever meet them?
I think we lost him.
Not yet.
For fuck's sake, I just watched it whilst writing this, and it still gives me shivers. It was just so fucking cool. And the Believe trailer with all the miniatures and the stop motion, that was just crazy. Again, this PR was off the fucking chain. The Starry Night trailer has to be one of my favourite game trailers of all time, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one out there that got swept up in the marketing campaign for Halo 3. I'm also sure that I'm not the only one who received a 360 that Christmas with a copy of Halo 3, being thrust into the Haloverse for the first time that Christmas morning. So for this review / essay / analysis, I'm going to be following a sort of normal review structure. I played through the main campaign of Halo 3 on PC and recorded the whole thing. I also played through some of the missions on Series X. I have used the Master Chief Collection version of the game, as that is the easiest way to play the game in 2021, and it offers the best range of technical options. I won't be going into multiplayer in much depth, as what I want to focus on is the campaign. So I'm going to examine the story, gameplay, graphics and audio. I'll be reviewing these elements whilst reflecting on my nostalgia along the way. So let's get into it. I have to be honest here, I found it difficult to come to this conclusion, but Halo 3's story is really not that great. Yeah, I know, I was shocked too. This is a tricky one to unpack, but I will do my best. Please don't get angry, this is just my opinion and you're totally allowed to love the story. But I'll try and justify my conclusion. It was towards the end of my most recent playthrough that I began to realise that my memory of the story was perhaps a bit clouded. I think there's a very good reason for this. When I was younger, I don't think I paid attention to the story that much. I enjoyed it for sure, and I can probably recite most of the lines off by heart, but I think when we are young, we don't really criticise and value good storytelling as much as we do when we're adults. I think this is for a few reasons. When we are children, we tend to, for the most part, consume content that is aimed at children. Some of the best storytelling I've encountered in the last 10 years tend to cover mature themes. I think that this is because the human experience tends to include mature themes that are absent from a lot of family-friendly content. The other reason is because as adults, we have a finite amount of time to consume content. We work jobs, we have families to look after, responsibilities that suck an enormous amount of our time. So I think as adults, we tend to be more picky and critical of the things we choose to spend our valuable free time with. Whereas children, we have a lot more time to consume content and stories. I'm speaking for myself obviously, but I think these are two important factors to consider when looking at nostalgia and why stories from our childhood may not hold up to the standards we set for content as adults. Specifically with Halo 3, there are a number of things to consider. Starting off with a positive, I think that the setting and the world building is superb. Halo manages to walk this fine line of being sci-fi without ever really crossing into the realms of fantasy. It's obviously based in the future, but not a distant future. The look of the people, the military, their vehicles and weapons are futuristic, but all bear a resemblance to the imagery and things we are familiar with in the present. This is important for the story as it provides a consistent feeling of groundedness, even when exploring alien planets on the other side of wormholes. The humans and their things are familiar to us. I have heard Halo described as a space opera before. I really don't think that is the case. In my mind, space operas always cross over into fantasy, and I don't think Halo ever really does that. The world, the characters, and the story are all grounded in science and physics. I absolutely love the setting. The futuristic human race and its culture is interesting, and I always want to know more. In particular, one of the focal points of the games is the Spartan program. Albeit a concept we have seen many times before, the Spartan program and our protagonist John 117, aka the Master Chief, provide a tried and tested story concept in the form of super soldiers. Not a lot of knowledge is provided about the Spartans within Halo 3, however, which may or may not have been intentional. But it certainly perked my interest when I was younger and may or may not have influenced me to go out and buy the novels which expand upon the story and origins of the Spartans. The plot, unfortunately, is just kind of forgettable. I know it off by heart because I played through it so many times as a youth, but replaying 14 years later, I can't say that I'm super impressed with it. It's not terrible, but it's not amazing either. It mainly consists of go here for this reason, and then we need to go here for another reason. It does what it needs to do to facilitate some interesting gameplay and regular changes in scenery, but 90% of the plot revolves around stopping the bad guys from doing something bad and saving the lead female character. It's basically the same plot of 1,000 action stories you've seen before. Like I said, it's not bad and I don't hate it, it just doesn't hit the mark for what I consider to be an amazing story in 2021. Moving on to the characters, I can't help but love the cast of this game. For the life of me, I find it hard to explain why. I mean, there's nothing really special about anyone in this game. But all the same, I love them. Most of the characters in this game are typecasts of characters you've seen before. You have the silent protagonist, the enemy turned ally, the sassy drill sergeant, the confident female leader, the generic general, and the creepy villain voiced by Brit. The most interesting character in Halo 3 by far is the Arbiter. If you were like me and hadn't played Halo 2 before starting the third game, you won't understand why he's interesting as it isn't explained very well. All you know is that he was the enemy previous to the start of the game and that he holds a grudge against the enemy we are fighting. He serves as a point of emotional expression in certain scenes where the Chief is completely void of expression. I mean, we never see the Chief's face, so even if he did display emotion, we wouldn't be able to see half of it. An issue I have with the Arbiter's writing is just that there isn't enough of it. Especially with the epic voice acting of Keith David, I'd just love to hear more from him. This is obviously a deeply personal and emotional quest for the Arbiter, and it's hard to understand exactly why unless you go back and play Halo 2. I can't exactly explain why, but I've always loved the trope of enemies turned allies, and there's something just so lovable about the Arbiter. It's hard to put my finger on, but yeah, he's certainly my favourite character. We don't get a lot of bro moments between the Chief and the Arbiter, but I still get immense satisfaction at the end of the game when the Chief stops for a moment to check the Arbiter hasn't been crushed to death by a tank and gives him the old head nod. Where the Arbiter left me wanting more, the other main characters left me not giving a shit about them. The Master Chief is a huge video game icon, but let's be honest here, in Halo 3, he's kinda boring. There are lots of interesting things about him, like being a Spartan and his ambiguous past. However, John 117 and his actual character in this game is almost non-existent. Most of his personal plot in the game revolves around Cortana, and even then, we never get a hint as to how he feels about the fact that she's gone. We never get a comment or a conversation about the numerous visions that he has about her. He is just a bit of a robot. Now, I know that the lore explains that Spartans were famously void of emotion and that part of the process of becoming a Spartan meant dampening of emotions, but that doesn't mean there isn't still room for expression from our protagonist. I mean, come on, he's just such a generic action man in this game. And it might have flown when I was younger, but not anymore for me. I feel like there are so many missed opportunities to give our main character something interesting to say, or do, or God forbid, feel. But maybe that's just a symptom of the times when Master Chief was written as a character. I look forward to replaying Halo 4 and 5 and seeing if this is a trend that continued as I look at it more with critical eyes. As for the other main characters of our cast, generic and boring is kind of all I have to say about them. Sergeant Johnson is entertaining for sure, and he has some great lines and is voiced perfectly by David Scully.
We must go. The brutes have our scent. Then they must love the smell of hero.
However, it's a tried and tested character trope and borders on stereotypical at points. Other characters just don't really have any screen time for more than what is required of them to facilitate the plot. It's not just the goodies that suffer for this, it's the villains as well. The Prophet of Truth is criminally underutilized. I mean, you have Terrence Stamp, fucking Zod, voicing him. Why not use him more? He is your bog standard religious zealot and generally doesn't have much interesting to say, which is a shame because he's not particularly visually or physically threatening, and given that he is only on screen for about 5 minutes towards the end of the game, it's a real shame he wasn't used more or given more interaction with the player. The other villain is the Gravemind, who just becomes annoying, I'm afraid. I love the concept of the Gravemind. A shape-shifting, infectious parasite with a personality has my interest piqued any day of the week. Unfortunately, much like Truth, the Gravemind never has much particularly interesting to say. It doesn't help that most of his dialogue takes place in these incredibly annoying vision sequences in the middle of gameplay, which disables the player from moving and attempts to trigger epileptic fits. Unfortunately, these moments are so fucking annoying that for me personally, I can't ever really focus on what the dude's actually saying, because I just want the moment to be over so I can get back to playing the game. The story does brush very closely to doing something interesting with the Gravemind villain when the Gravemind and our protagonist become allied briefly towards the end of the game, but other than the novelty of fighting side by side with the Flood for 5 minutes at the end of the Covenant mission, this plot point bears no fruit really. I would have loved to have seen the Gravemind fleshed out a bit. The Flood have the most menacing presence within the game in terms of antagonists, and I love their aesthetic. I find them comparable to John Carpenter's The Thing. The inner sci-fi geek in me just wants to see more of them and learn more about them. There are good things about the story. Like I mentioned before, the Arbiter and your interactions with him as the Master Chief are enjoyable, and if you're into sci-fi, the general concepts being put across for your understanding are cool and interesting, especially if you're familiar with the Halo lore. This is a trilogy though, so to get the most out of this story, you really have to play through the first 2 games. By itself, however, the story in Halo 3 is a bit lackluster. It's very short, but it does what it needs to do to facilitate and complement the gameplay, which is where this game really shined and still does. To anyone that plays modern first-person shooters, Halo 3 will be starting to show its age a bit in the gameplay department, mainly the shooting mechanics and the movement. However, I would like to argue that these older styles of mechanic, particularly the movement, are what give Halo 3 its characteristic Halo feel. The lack of ADS and the peculiar way that gravity is implemented into movement provide a feel to combat and traversal that feels very unique. Weapon variety and creativity is one of the highlights for me. Weapons are just as fun to use as I remember, and like always, I find myself constantly switching up my chosen weapons and using them all. Except for the assault rifle. I don't care what you say, I have always thought, and I still think, that the assault rifle is garbage and should be swapped out at the earliest opportunity. For one of the most commonly found weapons that is also on the box of the game, I always found this gun so disappointing. The game rewards players with efficient kills if they get headshots, and this gun doesn't register them. It can sometimes take more than a whole clip to kill an enemy, and at any range other than close, it's about as accurate as your piss after 10 pints of the good stuff. That's the only negative thing I have to say about the guns though. Everything else fucking rocks, even if they don't do a lot of damage. The plasma pistol is one of my favourite weapons, even though it does about as much damage as an ice cream scoop shooting it normally, but if you charge it up it will EMP basically anything in the game. This means you can charge shoot at any enemy with a shield, leaving them open to a headshot or a one-hit melee kill. It also means you can deactivate enemy vehicles at range when they are annoying the shit out of you, and this makes the gun very useful for hijacking enemy vehicles, which is one of the greatest things to do in the game. There are a huge variety of guns to choose from, and some of which are one-handed, which allows you to dual wield them. Different guns are definitely more or less useful depending on which enemy type you're currently fighting. The Covenant have the ability to use most weapons against you as well, which can make them super scary. These include brutes wielding gravity hammers and jackals using beam rifles, both of which can be a one-shot kill to the player if you aren't paying attention. Having enemies that can one-shot you regularly makes weapon choice very important. Being able to deal with these guys effectively and efficiently is crucial, especially on harder difficulties where enemies like this will be the bane of your existence. Enemy vehicles will also frequently piss in your cornflakes, so having weapons that can deal with them is crucial too. Luckily, the devs have made sure that there are always weapons suited to certain tasks available when needed. Now, in 2021, the lack of ADS will be a complete deal breaker for a lot of people. There is scoped ADS for some of the weapons, but this won't cut the mustard for a lot of you. I know certainly for me I found it jarring at first when ADS is something that I'm so used to having in modern titles. However, like I mentioned earlier, I think this complements Halo 3's unique gameplay style. Games didn't always have ADS, and I think this acts as a bit of a throwback to older styles of shooters and acts as a positive source of nostalgia. The shooting is still very much fun and engaging, especially with the huge variety of weapons on offer, and when combined with Halo's unique take on movement, I think it provides a feel to the combat that's quite special. Speaking of movement, Halo in general has a very odd mode of movement, and Halo 3 is the last example of it before it changes significantly in later games. Now, there are pros and cons to the movement as a whole. One of the pros, I think, is the gravity reduction. The physics implemented within the engine for movement have a reduced gravity feature, so when you jump, the amount of time you are in the air feels bizarrely long. I guess this was implemented to help Master Chief feel like a super soldier when traversing the environment. In an age where each new shooter is more realistic than the last, this is an odd feature to experience in 2021. However, I like it just as much as I liked it back in the day. It's what I think provides the characteristic Halo floaty feeling, and it can be immensely fun when used well, but can also be immensely frustrating when not used well. One thing I don't like about the movement, and this is simply a gripe I have with the age of the game, is the lack of a sprint. Now, this was added in later games, first being implemented as a pickup mod in Reach, but it's a creature comfort I struggle to do without in gaming these days. I like being able to dart from cover to cover, or to close the distance between myself and an enemy, or to feel like I'm running when I'm completing a segment that requires you to be moving quickly. The lack of a sprint option just makes you feel, fuck, this is slow, I wish I had a sprint button. I don't think Halo 3 has done anything wrong by not including this, it's just a symptom of being an older game and not having included a feature which is seen as common practice within the genre these days. One of my favourite aspects of Halo 3 is the pseudo-sandbox design of some of the larger level areas. I'll break this down a bit more when I talk about my favourite mission, Savo Highway, but navigating these huge maps was always a highlight for me. Navigating these levels in a Warthog, a Ghost, or even a Scorpion tank never gets boring. Mildly frustrating sometimes, yes, but never boring. The last section of the last mission in particular can be very frustrating, where the physics of the world seem to defy all sense and logic when making large jumps and landing at strange angles. Warthog bullshittery was the cause of many a failed run when running this level on legendary difficulty back in the day, and the source of many hormone-fueled rage outbursts from my friends and I. I can report that it is equally frustrating in 2021, vehicle behaviour is just as unpredictable. That being said, it still is just as fun as it used to be. The vehicle controls are a bit outdated, using the camera to point the direction you want to turn, and then the vehicle responding to that direction, opposed to having just a direct control that turns the vehicle. It took me a few minutes to get used to it again, as this is a control system that hasn't been used anywhere in games recently. The sheer range of vehicles you can use is amazing. The Covenant vehicles in particular are very fun to hijack and use for your own purposes. The scripted sequences that involve vehicles provide a nice break from the walking around, and they are fairly regular. The game switches up the vehicles as well, most notably with the Scorpion sequences. Also a really fun part of the Covenant level where you take control of a Hornet, which is a flying helicopter-like thing with machine guns attached and homing rockets. You fly along the coast of the Ark installation and have several air battles with Banshees and have to take out anti-air wraiths on the ground. You get another shot of these towards the end of the level where you have to take out 2 Scarab tanks at the same time. One of my favourite things to do during these sequences is to have a rocket launcher on hand. You can swap weapons with an AI soldier and they will jump into the passenger seat of your vehicle. The AI soldiers have infinite ammo, so if you give them a rocket launcher, you essentially have a rocket turret attached to whatever vehicle you're driving. This segues conveniently into AI. The AI in Halo 3 is fantastic, even by modern day standards. Your AI soldier buddies don't contribute much during moment-to-moment combat and will die if you let them, but to be honest, you don't really need them to do much. Where they shine is in the vehicle sequences. They can't drive for shit, and it can be frustrating if you want to take on the role of a turret or pretend the game is an Uber simulator. However, their aim and enemy targeting is brilliant. I'm always happy to let the AI shoot for me when driving a Warthog because they do an excellent job. Especially if you are tactical and give them decent weapons, so as passengers they can shred through enemy troops and vehicles with pretty stunning accuracy. The benefit of them having unlimited ammo makes rocket launchers and Spartan lasers way more useful in the AI's hands than your own. Enemy AI is fantastic too. I was worried that this would have aged poorly, but I'm happy to say I was impressed with how well it holds up. I have played a lot of shooter games in recent years where the AI of enemies leaves a lot to be desired, and Halo 3 has better enemy AI than a lot of them. There is a definite element of unpredictability when it comes to how enemies behave. Frequently they will charge you at moment's notice or run away when you are not expecting it. I have seen grunts spectacularly dodge plasma grenades, and on higher difficulties, all enemies dodge plasma grenades, and it's always impressive to see. The Flood in particular are super annoying in this respect, as they have a very chaotic nature to how they move and attack. The weird shape-shifting Flood enemies that can morph into turrets or tanks are super erratic. They may choose to rush you head on and fight in melee, or they may crawl up onto a wall and try and snipe you from range. Overall, the AI in Halo 3 has aged very well. I want to talk about my favourite mission in Halo 3, Savo Highway. I'll explain why it's my favourite mission. If this was your first time playing a Halo game, in Savo Highway it's your first time driving a Warthog. First time hijacking enemy vehicles, first time seeing the skyboxes and experiencing the scale of the outdoor map environments. It's also the first time you experience the scope of what a Halo game has to offer. For someone who has never played a Halo game before, there are a lot of firsts in Savo Highway. It's the first time in the game where the world properly opens up. The map and the questline is very linear, but one of the crazy things about Halo is that the world is like a pseudo sandbox. Although it's very linear, it doesn't feel like you're driving through a metaphorical narrow corridor of spaces and gameplay. It feels like you're a small part of a larger world. There are a number of things Bungie have done to achieve this. The first is a sense of scale. Throughout the level, a number of things happen that provide the player with a sense of scale, and in this case it makes you feel small compared to what is occurring in the rest of the world. One of my favourite moments is when the Covenant cruiser flies overhead what feels like right above you as you're tearing down the highway. Meanwhile, on the horizon you have the backdrop of an enormous crater containing the Ark. One of my favourite things that always amazes me when I see it and provides a real sense of scale within the map you're playing is the Wraith encounters. Wraiths are the Covenant tanks that fire a plasma mortar type projectile at you from across the map. The range and accuracy on these things is crazy, and there is one point in the mission where there are two of them firing at you from range. The plasma rounds arc way up into the sky, and I always can't help but stare at them like a moth with brain damage before remembering I have to dodge them at the last minute. I played through the game when researching this video, and even though I haven't played the game in a long time, old habits kicked in straight away. As soon as the first Wraith turned up, I knew that I wanted to steal it. My friends and I that played Halo together when I was younger always liked to treat missions as if we were playing Grand Theft Auto. Anytime an enemy vehicle comes around, it was our mission to hijack the bastard and use it against the enemy. My personal favourites are the Ghost and the Wraiths, although the Chopper should get a special mention because this thing is just so metal. Now, there are several points in the game where it's clear that Bungie do not intend for you to steal the enemy vehicles, such as the first Wraith encounter, where as soon as you disable it, a Pelican flies in and drops off another Warthog for the player to drive. I always thought, fuck that, I'm having the massive alien tank. I should say though that they don't explicitly stop you from doing this in any way, but obviously the provision of the Warthog kind of implies that they would like you to do that. One of the beautiful things about Halo is having options to approach these levels however you choose. It's quite easy to destroy the Wraith once you know how. You can jump onto the front or back of it, and if you have a grenade in your inventory you can jam one into the front or the back vent. Now, if you use your melee instead of a grenade on the front of the tank, you can break off a panel, exposing the driver. Now you can either keep punching, in which case he will eventually die, or if you want to reduce the damage you do to the tank, you can hop off and headshot him through the open panel. Can you tell that I played this a lot as a teenager yet? As soon as the driver is dead, the Wraith is free for you to commandeer, at which point the rest of the level becomes very easy. When playing this game back in the day trying to get the legendary difficulty achievements, it was essential to have at least one player occupy a Wraith in order to take out the dangerous enemies at range. Again, there are several points in the level where it feels like Bungie didn't explicitly want you using the Wraith, but they aren't trying to stop you entirely. It's another thing that contributed to the pseudo sandbox effect which I talked about earlier, where the game in essence is a very linear experience. But if you want to do things your own way, Bungie haven't prevented you from deviating from their intended method. It's this sense of freedom to approach the game from whatever angle you choose that makes the game so special and replayable. The gameplay loop in Halo 3 is fairly simple. It involves lots of shooting, with fun scripted vehicle segments to break it up. The game itself is fairly short, clocking at 5 to 8 hours playing on normal difficulty, however there is plenty of replayability to it. There are several difficulty levels to play on, the hardest of which is a real grind. This is a very different game mode on this, and is not for the faint of heart. It is damn near impossible in single player, and is best attempted in co-op. Oh yeah, Halo has co-op mode too. You can take up to 3 friends into the co-op campaign. They appear as the Arbiter and 2 elite soldiers. You can also add a variety of modifiers at the campaign selection screen, and add a score counter in which you and your friends can then compete for points. This won't appeal to everyone, but it adds a fun element when we're playing through the story with your mates. It used to be you had to find all the skulls throughout the campaign in order to unlock these modifiers, but with the Master Chief Collection, these are all unlocked from the get-go, and some new additional ones have been added as well. Let's talk about the graphics and art design. So I was a little unsure how to approach this section, as obviously how the game appears in the Master Chief Collection is very different to how it was originally in the first release of the game. The game was given a pretty hefty remaster in terms of graphics. I'm only going to talk about how the game appears in the Master Chief Collection because, as of writing this, it's pretty much the best way to play the game. The Master Chief Collection is free on Game Pass for both Xbox and PC, and is currently optimized for Series X. The PC version has a number of graphical options that PC gamers will be used to and runs perfectly. I run an RTX 2070 and had absolutely no issues running the enhanced version of the graphics on my PC. The Xbox version of the game runs great as well. I've played through on the Series X and it runs beautifully in 4K at 60 frames per second. The Master Chief Collection is the best way to relive this game from a graphics perspective. It gives players the luxury to experience the game graphically as they remember it. The remaster that Halo 3 has been given upscales the game very well to the standards of modern hardware. Certain aspects still show their age, particularly character models and facial animations, but these are only noticeable during cutscenes. The cutscenes haven't been given the same level of remastering that the first and second games got, but they are still much better than the original. Whenever I play other games from around about the same time Halo 3 was released, I always find myself painfully aware of how dated they look. This isn't a feeling I had at all really playing Halo 3 in the Master Chief Collection. The enhanced frame rate breathes life into the gameplay, and being able to experience it in 4K is a really nice touch. The remaster, with all of the features that come with it, allows returning players to experience Halo 3 in a way that is very similar or replicates what it felt like to play it when it was brand new on the 360 generation. Although character models may seem a bit dated, the animations hold up pretty well, in particular enemy animations. Everything seems to have upscaled really well to the new frame rates, and I didn't encounter any graphical bugs or glitches throughout my playthrough. Certain areas and textures may look a bit whack, particularly if you focus on them too much. For instance, I noticed that the horizon box for the Ark looks a bit dated if you stare at it for a bit too long. But I mean, what can I say? It's a horizon box from a 14-year-old game. There's only so much a remaster can do. The other thing that looks weird is Cortana during the vision sequences. It seems like they haven't actually remastered anything about this, so she looks kind of weird compared to the other remastered elements. I mean, I hate these sequences anyway, so it's not like it's a deal breaker for me. The art design in Halo 3 is top notch. Halo has a very unique colour palette which gives it a distinctive feel that isn't quite realism but almost halfway between realism and comic book style, which I really like, and I think this particular design choice helps it look good 14 years later. The world itself is beautifully designed and the levels look great. Outside is where Halo 3 really does its best, with interior parts of the levels not punching quite as hard. The mission Cortana, where you're on board a Covenant cruiser that has been infected with the Flood, is a highlight in terms of visuals. The whole thing is really fucking gross, but it looks amazing and blends two different styles of alien architecture really well. As I mentioned earlier, the world building in Halo 3 is superb. The art design facilitates this really well, with the design of enemies, weapons, vehicles, and the environment. The Forerunner installations are a favourite of mine, as to design and create an alien architecture that's so distinctive is really cool. In particular, the last mission where you're escaping the partially built Halo ring and you see the internal structures of the ring, it just all looks great and is really well designed. To be honest, in terms of graphics and visuals, I don't really have many complaints. It all looks as good as I remember. I do wonder how much of this is down to the remaster that's been done with the Master Chief Collection. I wonder if I dug out my 360 and booted up a dusky disc of Halo 3, would I feel the same playing it as I did in 2007? To be honest though, I don't think there's any point in that. The Master Chief Collection version exists, and it is the most convenient way for anyone to play it. This is a luxury that most games from this time don't have though, and I think that it gives it a significant boost in terms of replayability almost 15 years later. Now, I imagine I'll be preaching to the choir on this one, no pun intended, but the first thing to talk about is the soundtrack. Holy shit, it's awesome. It's as awesome as it was when I first heard it, and it hasn't aged a day. The Halo theme tune is probably the most recognisable theme tune from a modern video game, and even now prompts young lads to do shit like this. The score for the video game is beautiful, and really is up there in terms of all-time best soundtracks created for a video game. The massive set pieces have huge uplifting scores that to accompany them, and the softer, quieter moments have beautiful, ethereal tracks to go alongside them. Here are a few examples of where the soundtrack really enhances everything that's happening in-game.
This ain't good. Damn.
Even now, after all these years, and the hundreds upon hundreds of times I've completed Halo 3's campaign, the set piece moments where the theme kicks in as a backdrop to the spectacle, I still get this immense swell of emotion which I think is largely down to the music. I am a huge music fan, and I have a great appreciation for artists who can produce music that is almost as iconic as the content it goes with, and Halo 3's music certainly fits that bill. Halo 3 was the first time that the soundtrack and the main theme was recorded with a 60-piece orchestra, and you can really hear the difference. Martin O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore have become well-known names within the gaming community because of their work on these games. And Halo 3's version of the classic music, as well as the new music made specifically for it, have cemented it as being one of the most well-loved video game music albums ever made. I mean, the dude still gets 750,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. Like I said, I am probably preaching to the choir on this one, but yeah, the soundtrack is fucking class. End of story. The sound design on this game is top notch. Well, the Master Chief Collection version is anyway. In researching for this video, I found a few articles that detailed issues with Halo 3's audio mixing on the 360, which honestly, I can say I never noticed any issues with, but to be fair, I am a lot more observant than I was when I was 14, so I don't think I would have noticed any issues like that when I was playing back in the day. From what I can see though, any issues the game did have been ironed out with the remaster. The game sounds fantastic and is mixed very well. The sound design for weapons and vehicles in particular sounds so fucking good. All weapons have a unique sound to them. Some of them, more grounded, realistic weapons like the assault rifle and the shotgun, sound a little generic and kind of forgettable, but the alien weapons are where the sound design really shines. They all have a distinct, unique sound to them, and I know how much work and creativity it takes to create sounds from scratch. The voice acting in this game is superb, and you would expect it to be with the crazy cast that's involved. Ron Perlman, Keith David, Terrence Stamp, and Nolan North. Weirdly, also, half the cast of Firefly voices Marines in this game, which I didn't know until I was researching for this video. With such a star-studded cast in terms of voice acting, you expect quality, and quality is what you get. Some of the Marines sound a little silly sometimes, but it's totally forgivable. When it needs to shine, it shines, with dialogue being delivered in a believable and professional manner. Keith David steals the show like pretty much everything that he's in, voicing the Arbiter. Enemy voice acting is great as well. In particular, I love the brutes and the grunts. The grunts are a bit silly, but fun to have around, especially if you activate the I would have been your daddy modifier, which unlocks special dialogue options for the grunts to say, so you can catch them saying some pretty peculiar shit every now and again. I played a lot of Halo 3 multiplayer back in the day, like a lot. I haven't played multiplayer on the Master Chief Collection, so I'm not going to talk about multiplayer too much. It was recently announced that the original Halo 3 multiplayer servers are going to be taken offline, so the only way to play will be through the Master Chief Collection going forward. The Master Chief Collection multiplayer is a different beast, and I'll be honest, I'm not super interested in playing it to a point where I can confidently speak on it. Back in the day when I had a large group of friends who played Halo 3 multiplayer, the online was great crack. I have to say the most memorable moments came from the custom games. Between Forge mode, custom games, and community created maps and game modes you could download from Bungie.net, there was an infinite amount of fun to be had. I imagine anyone watching this will already have a good idea of what Halo 3 multiplayer is about, but if not, I'll give you a quick overview. Halo multiplayer is much more like traditional arena shooters. Maps consist of lanes and weapon pickups were a common feature. Time to kill is a lot higher than other shooters like Call of Duty, and this changes the flow of combat considerably. You have a large amount of health and a large shield, which vastly changes the feel of matches. You get a range of traditional game modes, but Halo really shines in its big team battles, often taking place in a large map with lots of weapon pickups and lots of vehicles. Some of my fondest memories of Halo multiplayer was flying around in a Warthog with your mates in the back trying to get as many kills as possible before getting sniped by a Spartan laser. One thing I want to mention quickly is the matchmaking system in the original Halo 3. It had one of the best matchmaking systems I have seen in any competitive shooter. One that I wish was implemented in more modern shooters. I'm looking at you, Call of Duty. The way it worked was you had a casual and skilled playlists. You had two different types of progression. You had your XP level, where XP was gained just from playing matches. It didn't matter which game mode you played, you'd always get XP and constantly be increasing your level. You also had a skill level. Now the skill level was increased by playing in skilled matches. This is where the sweaty shit went on. In a skill-based match, you went up against players a similar skill level to you, and depending on how well you did in that match, your skill level would either go up or down. This was a very clever way of separating players who just wanted to have some casual fun and players who wanted to sweat it out and prove that they are the best. Anyone who's played Call of Duty recently would agree that having a similar sort of system implemented to allow for casual play online is desperately needed. Sometimes I just want to have some carefree chill out games of COD, not to be spawn killed 10 times a row by a Korean 10-year-old. Giving sweaty cunts a place to be sweaty is a great idea. It's a shame more games don't implement a feature like this to give their player base more options. So in conclusion, how do I feel after looking at Halo 3 critically 14 years later after its first release? I have to say, I went into this thinking that my opinion of this game wouldn't be shifted and that I would walk away feeling that it was still the masterpiece that I thought it was. Unfortunately, the spell has been broken a little. I knew the gameplay would feel a little dated, but I expected to enjoy it all the same, which I did, to be honest. The graphics and the audio are both as good as I remember, clearly being held up by the Master Chief Collection remaster. Where I was let down, weirdly, is where I didn't expect to be let down, and that's with the story. I have to say, I really didn't enjoy it as much as I remember enjoying it when I was younger. I have already explained why I didn't enjoy it as much and why I think that I gave it a pass as a kid. I think these days I just need a lot more from my single player stories. Despite that, it doesn't erase the enjoyment I had for this game when I was a youth. It didn't stop me from having a blast replaying it. I think one of the important things about nostalgia is that it can let you enjoy things in the present that you wouldn't otherwise enjoy without your past. However, I think it's crucial to be able to acknowledge where nostalgia stops and starts and how it may affect your perception of things. It's absolutely fine to enjoy media from your past, but don't do it blindly. I still enjoyed this game, I just appreciate it in a slightly different light now, and I am more than happy to accept some of its flaws, but as an adult, I can't ignore them. For me, there are just so many factors that make Halo 3 a special game, and it's not just nostalgia, it's the world, it's the characters, the gameplay, the level design, the weapons, the vehicles, and the music. So many of these things are as good today as they were 14 years ago. Sure, a few aspects of the game are starting to show their age, but I still appreciate the game as a whole, and it's still one of my favourite games of all time. I can't say that I'll play through it again anytime soon, but it's nice to know that it's part of a collection of games that will be catered for and looked after well past the usual shelf life of a video game. One thing that I didn't anticipate was that making this video would make me want to replay Halo 4 and 5 and examine them in the same way. Perhaps I will be less harsh on them now that Halo 3 isn't so quite high up on my shelf anymore. And perhaps after doing all this deep reflecting, it will allow me to better understand my feelings towards Halo Infinite when I get to play it next month. I have had so much fun writing this review and examining one of my favourite games of all time. It's taken me a long time to write this, and it's kind of grown arms and legs the more I've gotten into it. If you agree or disagree with any of the points I've raised, please let me know in the comments. I'm super keen to know what people think, whether anyone else feels the same way or have points to make that I might have missed. Nostalgia is such a personal thing, and it will vary from person to person. If you feel like sharing your experience with Halo 3, go for it. This review of my nostalgia is something that I plan to do for some other of my favourite games. At some point I'd like to take a look at BioShock, the Dawn of War series, and maybe some older Star Wars games. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing to stay tuned. If you want to help out with the channel, give the video a like and turn on notifications. It makes a big difference. Thanks for watching.